Hello, my name is Laura Davis and I'm going to talk to you today about Alice Munro's story called Gravel. So first a quick summary of the story. The narrator of the story, who is unnamed, walks us through a traumatic instance in their past. And the narrator is an adult, but the protagonist, which is the narrator, is a child. So the adult is actually looking back on their childhood and explaining their childhood to the reader. So there's a lot of interesting moments in the story when we have the narrator kind of thinking and showing us that they're an adult looking back on the childhood. Okay, so the protagonist is a child, the narrator is an adult narrator looking back on their childhood. And what happens basically to the narrator, protagonist of the story, is that he or she, we actually don't know whether it's a boy or a girl. I kind of assumed it was a girl until closer to the end when I realized that it was left a bit more ambiguous than that. So the narrator and protagonist, same person, in their childhood, their parents became divorced. The mother gets pregnant with a child, and she tells the father that it's not his child. Now later the narrator actually questions that, which is an interesting moment in the text. Thinks maybe it all this time was the father's child, but in any case, the mother tells him otherwise, leaves him, and moves in with her boyfriend Neil into a trailer. The child and her sister Carol go with the mother and the new boyfriend Neil to the trailer, which is kind of on the edge of the town and is near a gravel pit. And the gravel pit is seen and is noted as a moment of a place of danger for the children. And it's central to the story because later in the story, the narrator's sister Carol drowns in the gravel pit. And this is the trauma that the whole story kind of narrates around, and that the narrator is trying to come to terms with later in her life. And Blitzy, the dog, plays an important part because Caro, in the narrator's telling of this traumatic event, they are both, the narrator and Caro are both at the gravel pit, and it's filled with water, and the Caro throws the dog into the water and tells, and well, even before she throws the dog in, Blitzy, she tells the narrator, you go and tell Neil and Mom what happened. And she said, tell them that the dog's in the water and that I've gone in to save it. And so we see the dog being thrown into the water by Caro, and then we see Caro jumping in after, which seems to be an act of suicide. But this is all told through the narrator's memories, and there's a lot of foregrounding of the fact that it is her memory, and there's bits that she remembers and bits that she's not sure if she remembers correctly or if she's sort of filled in to kind of piece together this traumatic event in her past. And the story ends with her him or her, the narrator, much later in life, going back to Neil and asking Neil about the event. And also the protagonist at this point talks about having seen a counselor with regard to memories surrounding this traumatic event and the loss of her sister. Okay, so that's kind of a brief summary of the story. It's a very powerful story, a very tragic story. Alice Munro does tend to write fairly gothically. She has a lot of death, a lot of mystery, a lot of ghosts very subtly in her writing. So this is no exception there. And actually drowning is something that comes up in quite a few of her stories, interestingly, in troubling ways, in the sense that each of her stories that involves a drowning really is tragic and makes the reader kind of think about the circumstance and the tragedy of that circumstance. So the significance of the title, it is called Gravel, and I see that as, they're on a gravel road at the end of the city, but there's also this gravel pit, and gravel also has a connotation of kind of roughness and of like rubbing against the skin, and I think that is like the narrator themselves, who is having this sense of their past kind of gravel. It's gravel, it's roughness in their soul. So lots of significance to the title. Another thing I want to mention is the mailbox scene. So the scene where the mother and I believe the narrator is with the mother, goes to the mailbox to collect the mail and sees a wolf there. And then they slowly and quietly walk away. And when they get back, they talk to Neil about it, and the mother says you should get to Neil that you should get your gun because she doesn't want to go out when there's this wolf around. And he says, no, I'm a peaceful person. This wolf probably has babies, right? So it kind of that moment sort of on the one hand builds Neil's character. He is, as I said, he has certain what he calls ideals that align with peacefulness, nonviolence, and so on. But at the same time, there's a sense of irresponsibility and selfishness with regard to the character of Neil. So I think as a reader, at least for me, I was quite frustrated with the character. And I think that perhaps that's what the Munro and the narrator kind of wanted us to feel and to think about, is this sense of selfishness and irresponsibility at the same time that Neil thinks he's kind of upholding these ideals. So Neil's quite an interesting and, problematic character in that regard. The wolf also is a kind of foreshadowing of danger. Here we see a clear moment of danger. Interestingly, it's at the mailbox, which is a place of communication, a place where messages get sent back and forth. And I think in a sense the wolf himself there, or herself, the wolf, is a message that there will be danger forthcoming. And it is soon after that moment where the wolf appears at the mailbox that you get the drowning of Caro. I wanted to mention too Neil's profession as an actor, and I think it's significant that Munro mentions some of the literary works, the plays that Neil has acted in. Again, Munro tends to have quite a few kind of actors or artists as characters in her texts, and I think this idea of acting or pretending or playing a part that is both yourself and apart from yourself is something that does come up as a kind of theme in the text. We also see it with Caro because the narrator describes Caro as always having a drama, and we see that we get told about the scene where she takes Blitzy under her coat on the school bus and leaves Blitzy at her father's house as kind of a way to try and give a message again, this idea of messages and communication, that she wants to reconnect her father and her mother, that she misses the old home and her father's house and so on. So what was I saying there? Yes, the foreshadowing of danger with the wolf, the acting, and the fact that Neil is an actor. Notice that he plays Banquo in Macbeth, and he's referred to as a ghost because Banquo in Macbeth does appear as a ghost. And I think this is relevant in terms of the narrator and her own trauma, because Neil is a part of that trauma, and in a way he is a ghost who continues to haunt her through her life, even after she doesn't, even many, many years after Caro's death, because the story is written many years after, and we get that because of how she talks as she's an adult looking back on her childhood. We hear about how she's going to counseling later in life. We hear about what her career is later in life, and she actually seeks out Neil to talk to him about that event later in her life. So he's a kind of ghost in a sense that haunts her, and because he is part of this traumatic event. And there's a lot of talk around who's responsible for this event too. And I think that Munro isn't laying blame on any one person, but is just kind of putting that idea of responsibility / irresponsibility out there and getting us to think about that, right? And to think about these accidents that happen that are, in a sense, no one's fault, and at the same time, everybody's fault, right? So, the narrator has guilt for her own self, thinking that she's at fault because she didn't get Neil and her mother fast enough. We also, as readers, sense that it's Neil and her mother's fault for not looking after the children properly. Again, there's a kind of parallel with the wolf scene, because Neil says about the wolf, the wolf probably has babies at home, just like you're trying to protect yours. The wolf might be trying to protect theirs. But in fact, Neil and the mother don't really engage in that protection of Caro and the narrator, as much as they should. That's how it's portrayed, that there's a sense of irresponsibility there. And also with the father, right? The father's in the city and he's not there. So I think that Munro's really kind of opening up this question of who's responsible to care for others. Why is there even this gravel pit that's wide open and dangerous? What about these dangers in the world, and what are our roles, to come back to the actor theme again, around these kinds of situations? And again, I don't think Munro's placing any particular blame on anybody, but just opening up that question for us to think about and to contemplate those ideas. Gender is really interesting in the text, in part because the narrator is we don't know whether the narrator is a boy or a girl. The name Caro, the sister, is also kind of a gender neutral sort of name. Near the end of the story, we are told by the narrator that their partner is named Ruth Ann. So that's the point at which I wasn't sure if the narrator was a male or a female, because if it is a female, then that's a lesbian relationship, and if it's a male, that is a heterosexual relationship. I think that point where Ruth Ann is named as the partner just makes you kind of think, oh, is this a woman narrator, or is this a man narrator, or is this what's going on here? And then you realize that it's never actually made clear in the text. And I think Munro does that purposely. Again, not for a clear identifiable reason, but perhaps to problematize and get us to think about gender roles in literature and in life. Finally, the ending I want to mention. The notion of the splash, I love that ending. I think it's absolutely beautiful and troubling at the same time, because Munro says, the narrator says, that she's still waiting to hear the splash, that she never, in her memory, never hears the splash of Caro jumping into the water. And to me, that's a sense of that it's still not resolved in her mind, that she's still working to come to terms, and perhaps always will be, with this traumatic event and the loss of her sister. She's still waiting for that splash. She's still waiting for the resolution of this, and she doesn't have all the answers, and she may never have all the answers, and she may have to accept that she doesn't have all the answers, and it won't be entirely resolved ever. So Munro's endings tend to be not simple and clear, but rather ones that get us to kind of sit back and think and contemplate what the story means. So a beautiful story, a tragic story, lots to talk about with regard to significance of the title, narrative voice, the adult first-person narrator looking back, memory, very complex in the story in terms of the narrator being explicit about what they remember and what memories are more fuzzy or perhaps filled in. Lots of foreshadowing with regard to the wolf scene, for example. Character development is really interesting in this story, with Neil and the mother, Josie and the father, the narrator and Caro. All of them have interesting character traits as well. And of course the ending, which is both resolved and unresolved, right? She's gone to Neil, she's had that conversation, she's a functioning adult now who has a relationship and a good career, and yet there's still this kind of sense that that trauma will always be there, and the loss of her sister will always be there with her. Okay, that's it for now. Thank you for listening to this short video on Alice Munro's Gravel. Bye for now.